Hi everyone, I'm Beatriz Palma Vega, a student from the University Pablo de la Vide in Seville, Spain. We are in Introduction to Sociology, and we are making this book club with our lecturer Maria Jose del Pino Espejo. And I've chosen The Suicide by Émile Durkheim. This book was first published in 1897 in Paris. I'm going to read half a chapter because the entire chapter is too long. But first of all, I'm going to make a little introduction to his life, to Émile Durkheim's life. So, David Émile Durkheim was born in France in 1858, and like Marx, whose youth was spent during the tumultuous first half of the 19th century. By the time Durkheim was a young man, France was experiencing one of its longest governments, the Third Republic. He could spend his entire life living and working in France. Intelligent and productive, Durkheim would do much to create and institutionalize the new discipline of sociology in France. About his life, Durkheim's mother, Melanie, was the daughter of a horse merchant. His father, Moise, was a regional chief rabbi. Moise's father and grandfather before him had been rabbis as well. Um, as a young boy, it was assumed that Emil Durkheim would also one day be a rabbi, but it was not to be. After going to college, Durkheim broke with religion altogether. Nevertheless, he always remained part of the Jewish community. In 1887, he married a young embroiderer named Louise Julie Dreyfus, the daughter of a director of a foundry, and together they had two children, Maribela, born in 1888, and Armand, born in 1892. It is said that Louis was well educated and helped Emile with his work. Where Emile was austere, Louis was light-hearted. By all counts, they had a happy marriage. Andre would die in 1915 from an injury sustained in battle in Bulgaria. When waiting to hear news of his son on the battlefront, he wrote to a close friend, "The image of this exhausted child alone at the side of a road in the midst of night and fog, that seized me by the throat." It is said that the death of his son precipitated Emile Durkheim's decline and early death, following a stroke at age 59. About his career, Durkheim earned degrees from his local college in 1874 and 1875 when he was only 17. At that age, he wanted to be a college professor, and the only way to do this was to attend the École Normale Supérieure in France. By all counts, life in Paris was very difficult for him, as he did not have a lot of money and he did not feel at home. It took him 2 years before he passed entrance exams necessary to attend the prestigious institution. Once there, he considered much of what he was forced to study sheer poppycock. Although never perhaps shaking the feeling of being an impostor, he was admitted to the highest intellectual cycles. He participated in debates. He became friends with philosophers, historians, and psychologists, a new and exciting field in debates. In At that time, sorry. Psychologists, a new and exciting field at the time. After graduating in 1883, he took a teaching post in Bordeaux, where he lived with his growing family until 1902. In 1892, he briefly returned to Paris, where he earned his PhD for the division of labor. In 1902, he moved to Paris permanently to teach at the Sorbonne, where he continued until his death in 1917. He did much to create the field of sociology in France, largely by overseeing the sociology journal L'Année Sociologique and by helping advance the career of young sociologists. He was also an advisory editor on the first USA sociology journal, the American Journal of Sociology. About politics, Durkheim lived and worked during the Third Republic, a relatively stable period in France that was, in theory, committed to parliamentary democracy as opposed to constitutional monarchy or socialism. We could say the Third Republic was a compromise government and that its stability could perhaps be attributed to its moderation. Durkheim was actively involved with supporting the Third Republic and saw sociology as the science that could lead to better policy making. He was also an outspoken critic of anti-Semitism and much in sympathy with socialism. Durkheim once told a close friend with a moving simplicity how, at a certain moment of his spiritual life, he had to admit to himself that he was a socialist. During World War One, he was active in supporting France and even wrote a series of short articles decrying the German mind for its tendency to militarism and overreach. And just to finish, his main works are The Division of Labor, The Suicide, Rules of Sociological Method, and Elementary Forms of or Religious Life. Okay, so now I just want to say, after this brief biography, I want to comment that the book is divided in three books, or three parts. The first one is the extra social factors. The second one is social causes and social types. And the third one, general nature of suicide as a social phenomenon. Okay, so um, I'm going to read the egoistic suicide, which is part of the second book that analyzes social causes and social types. But I'm going to read half of it, as I said, because it takes too it's too long. So yeah, I'm just going to read half a chapter, okay, and then I will comment some things of the book. Okay, so I'm going to search the chapter. Just a moment. Okay. Okay. So, okay. I'm going to start reading. Remember, it's the second. Is the second book. In the second moon, the book, The Egoistic Suicide, which is the second chapter. Okay. So, first, let's us see how the different religious confessions affect suicide. If one casts a glance at the map of European suicide, it is at once clear that in purely Catholic countries like Spain, Portugal, Italy, suicide is very little developed, while it is at its maximum in Protestant countries, in Prussia, Saxony, Denmark. The following averages, compiled by Morselli, which is other author, confirm this first conclusion. So now we have a table. I'm going to read this one because it's short, but the rest of the tables I'm not going to read it because there are a lot of numbers and it's impossible. So yeah, we have this average suicides per million inhabitants, and we have in Protestant states 190, in mixed states, Protestant and Catholic, 96, in Catholic states, 58, and in Greek Catholic states, 40. Okay, continue reading. Um, the low proportion of the Greek Catholics cannot be surely attributed to religion, for as their civilization is very different from that of the other European nations, this difference of culture may be the cause of their lesser aptitude. But this is not the case with most Catholic or Protestant societies. To be sure, they are not all on the same intellectual and moral level, yet the resemblance are sufficiently essential to make it possible to ascribe to confessional differences the marked contrast they offer in respect to suicide. Nevertheless, this first comparison is still too summary. In spite of undeniable similarities, the social environments of the inhabitants of these different countries are not identical. The civilization of Spain and Portugal are far below that of Germany, and this inferiority may conceivably be the reason for the lesser development of suicide which we have just mentioned. If one wishes to avoid this source of error and determine more definitely the influence of Catholicism and Protestantism on the suicidal tendency, the two religions must be compared in the heart of a single society. Of all the great states Germany, Bavaria has by far the fewest suicides. There have been barely 90 per million inhabitants yearly since 1874, while Prussia has 133. The Duchy of Baden 156, Württemberg 162, Saxony 300. Now Bavaria also has most Catholics, 713.2 to 1,000 inhabitants. On the other hand, if one compares the different provinces of Bavaria, suicides are found to be in direct proportion to the number of Protestants and in inverse proportion to that of Catholics. Not only the proportion of averages to one another confirm the law, but all the numbers of the first column are higher than those of the second, and those of the second higher than those of the third, without exception. He's talking about these tables, and the same happened in Prussia. Um, there are only two slight irregularities among the 14 provinces, thus compared, so far as detail is concerned. Silesia, which because of its relatively high number of suicides should be in the second category, is only in the third, while on the contrary, Pomerania would be more in its place in the second than in the first column. Switzerland forms an interesting study from this same point of view, for as both French and German population exist there, the influence of the confession is observable separately on each race. Now, its influence is the same on both. Catholic cantons show 4 and 5 times fewer suicides than Protestant, of whichever nationality. Confessional influence is therefore so great as to dominate all others. Besides, in a fairly large number of cases, the number of suicides per million inhabitants of the population of each confession has been directly determined. The following figures were obtained by various observers. So now we have more tables, and yeah, we can see how there are more suicides between Protestant than Catholics or Jews. Okay, so thus everywhere without exception, Protestants show far more suicides than the followers of other confessions. The difference varies between a minimum of 20 to 30% and a maximum of 300%. It is useless to invoke with Mer, which is other author, against such an anonymous agreement of facts. The isolated case of Norway and Sweden, which though Protestant have only an average number of suicides. Okay, I'm going to, one moment, please. Okay, okay. First, as we noted at the beginning of this chapter, these international comparisons are not significant unless bearing on a considerable number of countries, and even in this case are not conclusive. There are sufficiently great differences between the peoples of the Scandinavian peninsula and those of Central Europe for it to be reasonable that Protestantism does not produce exactly the same effects on both. But furthermore, if the suicide rate is not in itself very high in these two countries, it seems relatively so if one considers their modest rank among the civilized peoples of Europe. There is no reason to suppose that they have reached an intellectual level above Italy, to say the least, yet self destruction occurs from twice to three times as often, 90 to 100 suicides per million inhabitants, as against 40. So, may Protestantism not be the cause of this relatively higher figure? Thus, the fact not only does not tell against the law just established on the basis of so many observations, but rather tends to confirm it. The aptitude of youth for suicides is always less than that of Protestants. In a very general way, it is also, though to a lesser level degree, lower than that of Catholics. Occasionally, however, the later relation is reversed. Such cases occur especially in recent times. Up to the middle of the century, Jews killed themselves less frequently than Catholics in all countries but Bavaria. Only towards 1870 do they begin to lose their ancient immunity. They still very rarely greatly exceed their rate for Catholics. Besides, it must be remembered that Jews live more exclusively than other confessional groups in cities and are in intellectual occupations. On this account, they are more inclined to suicide than the members of other confessions, for reasons other than their religion. If therefore the rate for Judaism is so low in spite of this aggravating circumstance, it may be assumed that other things being equal, the religion has the fewest suicides of all. These facts establish what is their explanation. So, if we consider that the Jews are everywhere in a very small minority, and that in most societies where the foregoing observations were made, Catholics are in the minority, we are tempting to find in these facts the cause explaining the relative rarity of voluntary death in these two confessions. Obviously, the less numerous confessions facing the hostility of the surrounding populations in order to maintain themselves are obliged to exercise severe control over themselves and subject themselves to an especially rigorous discipline. To justify the always precarious tolerance granted them, they have to practice greater morality. Besides these considerations, certain facts seem really to imply that this special factor has some influence. In Prussia, the minority status of Catholics is very pronounced, since there are only a third of the whole population. They kill themselves only one third as often as the Protestants. The difference decreases in Bavaria, where two-thirds of the inhabitants are Catholics. The voluntary death of the latter are here only in the proportion of 100 to 275 of those of Protestants, or else of 100 to 238, according to the period. Finally, in the almost entirely Catholic Empire of Austria, only 155 Protestant to 100 Catholic suicides are found. It could seem then that that where Protestantism becomes a minority, its tendency to suicide decreases. But first, suicide is too little an object of public condemnation for this slight measure of blame attaching to it to have some influence, even on minorities, oblique by their situation to pay special heed to public opinion. As it is an act without offense to others, it involves no great reproach to the groups more inclined to it than others, and is not apt to increase greatly their relative ostracism, as could certainly be the case with a greater frequency of crime and misdemeanor. Besides, when religious intolerance is very pronounced, it often produces an opposite effect. Instead of exciting the dissenters to respect opinion more, it accustoms them to disregard it. When one feels himself an object of inescapable hostility, one abandons the idea of conciliating it, and is the more resolute in his most unpopular observances. This has frequently happened to the Jews, and thus the exceptional immunity probably has another cause. Anyway, this explanation would not account for the respective situation of Protestants and Catholics, for though the protective influence of Catholicism is less in Austria and Bavaria, where it is in the majority, it is still considerable. Catholicism does not therefore owe this solely to its minority status. More generally, whatever the proportional share of these two confessions in the total population, wherever their comparison has been possible from the point of view of suicide, Protestants are found to kill themselves much more often than Catholics. There are even countries like the Upper Palatine of Upper Bavaria where the population is almost wholly Catholic, 92 and 96%, and where there are nevertheless 300 and 423 Protestant suicides to 100 Catholic suicides. The proportion even rises to 528% in Lower Bavaria, where the Reformed religion has not quite one follower to 100 inhabitants. Therefore, even if the prudence incumbent on minorities were a partial cause of the great difference between the two religions, the greatest share is certainly due to other causes. We shall find these other causes in the nature of these two religious systems. Yet they both prohibit suicide with equal emphasis. Not only do they penalize it morally with great severity, but both teach that a new life begins beyond the tomb, where men are punished for their evil actions, and Protestantism, just as well as Catholicism, numbers suicides among them. Finally, in both cults, um, these prohibitions are of divine origin. They are represented not as the logical conclusion of correct reason, but God Himself is their authority. Therefore, if Protestantism is less unfavorable to the development of suicide, it is not because of a different attitude from that of Catholicism. Thus, if both religions have the same precepts with respect to this particular matter, the similar influence on suicide must proceed from one of the more general characteristics differentiating them. I'm going to turn up this. Okay. No. Okay. Okay. Um, the only essential difference between Catholicism and Protestantism is that the second permits free inquiry to a far greater degree than the first. Of course, Catholicism, by the very fact that it is an idealistic religion, concedes a far greater place to thought and reflection than Greco-Latin polytheism or Hebrew monotheism. It is not restricted to mechanical ceremonies, but seeks the control of its conscience. So it appeals to conscience, and even when demanding blind submission of reason, does so by employing the language of reason. Nonetheless, the Catholic accepts his faith ready-made without scrutiny. Um, without scrutiny. He may not even submit it to historical examination, since the original texts that serve as its basis are proscribed. A whole hierarchical system of authority is devised with marvelous ingenuity to render tradition invariable. All variation is abhorrent to Catholic thought. The Protestant is far more the author of his faith. The Bible, the Bible is put in his hands, and no interpretation is imposed upon him. The very structure of the Reformed cult stresses these states of religious individualism. Nowhere but in England is the Protestant clergy a hierarchy. Like the worshippers, the priest has no other source but himself and his conscience. He's a more instructive guide than the run of worshippers, but with no special authority for fixing no dogma. But what best proves that this freedom of inquiry proclaimed by the founders of the Reformation has not remained a Platonic affirmation is the increasing multiplicity of all sorts of sects, so strikingly in contrast with the indivisible unity of the Catholic Church. We thus reach our first conclusion that the proclivity of Protestantism for suicide must relate to the spirit of free inquiry that animates these religions. Let's, let us understand this relationship correctly. Um, Free inquiry itself is only the effect of another cause. When it appears, when men, after having long received their ready made faith from tradition, claim the right to shape it for themselves. This is not because of the intrinsic desirability of free inquiry, for the latter involves as much sorrow as happiness, but it is because men henceforth need this liberty. This very need can have only one cause: the overthrow of traditional beliefs. If they still asserted themselves with equal energy, it would never occur to men to criticize them. If they still had the same authority, men could not demand the right to verify the source of this authority. Okay. So reflection develops only if its development becomes imperative. That is, if certain ideas and instinctive sentiments which have hitherto adequately guided conduct are found to have lost their efficacy. Then reflection intervenes to fill the gap that has appeared, but which it has not created. Just as reflection disappears to the extent that thought and action take the form of autonomic habits, it awakes only when accepted habits become disorganized. It asserts its rights against public opinion only when the latter loses strength, that is, when it is no longer prevalent to the same extent. If these assertions occur not merely occasionally and as passing crises, but become chronic, if individual conscience keep reaffirming their autonomy, it is because they are constantly subject to conflicting impulses, because a new opinion has not been formed to replace the one no longer existing. If a new system of beliefs were constituted, which seem as indisputable to everyone as the whole, no one would think of discussing it any longer. Its discussion would no longer even be permitted, for ideas shared by an entire society draw from this consensus an authority that makes them sacrosanct and raises them above dispute. For them to have become more tolerant, they must first already have become the object of less general and complete assent and been weakened by preliminary controversy. Thus, if it is correct to say that free inquiry once proclaimed multiplies schemes, it must be added that it presupposes them and derives from them, for it is claimed and instituted as a principle only in order to permit latent or half-declared schemes to develop more freely. So, if Protestantism concedes a greater freedom to individual thought than Catholicism, it is because it has fewer common beliefs and practices. Now, a religious society cannot exist without a collective credo, and the more extensive the credo, the more unified and strong is the society. For it does not unite men by an exchange and reciprocity of services, a temporal bond of union which permits and even presupposes differences, but which a religious society cannot form. It socializes men only by attaching them completely to an identical body of doctrine, and socializes them in proportion as this body of doctrine is extensive and firm. The more numerous the manners of action and thoughts of a religious character are, which are accordingly removed from free inquiry, the more the idea of God presents itself in all details of existence, and makes individual wills converge to one identical goal. Inversely, the greater concessions a confessional group makes to individual judgment, the less it dominates lives, the less its cohesion and vitality. We thus reach the conclusion that the superiority of Protestantism with respect to suicide results from its being a less strongly integrated church than the Catholic Church. This also explains the situation of Judaism. Indeed, the reproach to which the Jews have for so long been exposed by Christianity has created feelings of unusual solidarity among them. Their need of resisting a general hostility, the very impossibility of free communication with the rest of the population, has forced them to strict union among themselves. Consequently, each community became a small, compact, and coherent society with a strong feeling of self-consciousness and unity. Everyone thought and lived alike. Individual divergences were made almost impossible by the community of existence and the close and constant surveillance of all over each. The Jewish Church has thus been more strongly united than any other, from its dependence on itself because of being the object of intolerance, um, um, by analogy with what has just been observed apropos of Protestantism. The same cause must therefore be assumed for the slight tendency of the youth to suicide, in spite of all sorts of circumstances which might, on the contrary, incline them to it. Doubtless, they owe this immunity in a sense to the hostility surrounding them. But if this is its influence, it is not because it imposes a higher morality, but because it obliges them to live in greater union. They are immune to this degree because the religious society um, is of such solidarity. Besides, the ostracism to which they are subject is only one of the causes producing this result. The very nature of Jewish beliefs must contribute largely to it. Judaism, in fact, like all early religions, consists basically of a body of practices minutely um, governing all the details of life and leave free room to individual judgment. Okay, so this is a half a chapter, and I'm going to comment a little bit about this and about the rest of the book now. So about this part, I found really interesting what he explains about Jews and about England. I don't know if it's here. I don't remember. Yeah, I think it's in the second part of the chapter. But he talks how in England, um, they are less. There are less suicides between among Protestants than in other Protestant countries, and this is because the organization is more alike to Catholic countries. They have like the same structure. For example, they have more or less the same number of priests and churches. So they are like more united between them than Protestants, than the rest of the Protestants. Yeah, because they are Protestants. Um, yeah, from Protestant of other countries. That's what I meant to. Um, and then the Jewish, how they are discriminated, and they use this to create a strong society or a strong community, and they try their best, and they are the best in every field, um, because of this discrimination. So they use the discrimination in a positive way. Yeah, of course, I think they would have preferred not to suffer this, but it's an example of how discrimination can be used in a to be the best in in yeah, in your jobs, in studies, and yeah, wherever. So, and then that's like the part of the religions, but then he talks in egoistic suicide. He talks about family, marriage, and family. For example, he talks about if your family is bigger, if there are more members than in other families, you are less inclined to commit suicide. But the bond between the members of the family have to be strong. Yeah, I found that interesting too. Um, then in egoistic suicide, he mentioned, if yeah, I think he mentioned how political crisis um, don't affect to suicide, don't affect. But I'm going to mention later. I'm going to mention something different, other type of crisis. But then, first of all, I have to mention this is one of the types of suicide, the egoistic one, which is I think it's the most common one, and we can say it's when um, you you don't feel comfortable with the rest of the society, or you don't feel part of the society, so you commit suicide. It's like you only think on yourself. um, but then we have the altruistic one, which is the second type. In this case, it's the opposite to the egoistic suicide. The altruistic suicide, commit suicide, in this case, is for the society. um, an example of this could be the military. So they are going to um, give their life to defend their countries. And then the harakiri of Japanese communities. Yeah, so they think that there are, in most of these cases, they think that there is life after, there's an afterlife. So um, they commit suicide for the society, because of the respect they have for this society, um, and because they think there are other life after death. um, in most of the cases, it's not in all the cases, but in many of them. um, and then we have the anomic suicide, which is the last type. um, in this case is when there's a big change in the society. We are talking about crisis, but economic crisis. So like the example could be um, the Great Depression, or 2008 crisis, or the pandemic. There were a lot of suicide in these different periods. But it's not only economic crisis. It could be when there's a big change in a positive way. So if tomorrow the economy um, change in a good way, and the society can perceive this change, it could affect to suicide, and people um, will commit more suicide. And just to finish, in the beginning of the book, he mentioned extra social causes. So things that can affect to the individuals, but no, maybe not to the entire society. Um, for example, alcohol. He mentioned alcohol as a thing that can affect an individual, but not the entire society. This is in 19th century, so maybe it's not what happened now. I don't know, but yeah, he said that. And then he mentioned one thing that affect in this case is the sunlight. But it's an extra social cause because yeah, it affects um, for example, I'm going to say um, when in spring and summer there are more suicides, and I thought it was the opposite, and it's because of the light. So when days are longer, people commit more suicides, and this is because there is more social life. So that's what make people more inclined to suicide. I didn't know about this. Yeah, he mentioned how it's not the weather, it's the light, the sunlight, what affect. Yeah. And he said this in the part of extra social causes. Okay. And just to finish, I wanted to say that in the three types of suicide, um, it can be more than one. It's yeah, it maybe it's one, but sometimes there are two two of them. Um, so, and yeah, just this is what I wanted to comment about the book. And just um, one more thing. Um, I think we have a problem with suicide. I think in other countries like Japan, there's now a ministry of loneliness. Um, I think, in my opinion, I think it's something that we have to be worried about. And I think there are going to be more and more suicides because of this individualism we are living. and the pressure of social media. And we are seeing this in among young people. um, there are more and more suicides, and young people with mental illness. And I think we are talking more about mental illness, but not about, for example, specifically about suicide. So I think governments have to invest more money uh, in mental health, because I think this is going to be the new pandemic. I think um, this is one of the most dangerous issues we have nowadays. And I think we are not taking decisions, um, and I think we should. I think we should, but it's really a problem among young people. Um, many of them thought at least one time of hurt themselves. So yeah, I think we should focus on this. I think we should learn how to talk about this, because I think we talk about mental illness, about depression, anxiety. We are talking more and more since some years ago, um, but not about suicide, because I think we don't know how to do it. Um, so I think we should learn, because it's gonna be, or it is, um, a problem now. Um, and just to finish, I want to recommend um, two books. One of them is Hermann Hesse book, which was uh, Beneath the Wheels. I think it's in English, Beneath the Wheels, and it's about education, mental illness, how can affect the education, or the education to children. Um, then there's another book. This is more. I think it's tougher, which is a Little Life. I don't remember the author. I think it's a woman, but I don't remember her name. It's about four friends, um, how they grow up, and one of them has mental issues, and he how he deals with this, and how the people around him try to help him. But yeah, we see the difficulties of um, of this. And then three movies about mental illness too. One of them is a Norwegian movie, which is called Oslo 31st August. Um, yeah, it's a movie. It's one of the movie of the trilogy of Oslo, by the director Joachim um, uh, Joachim. Well, I don't remember the last name, but it's really really interesting. and how it's how a man deals with this idea of suicide, and what he talks with his friends and his family, and what he thinks about himself. I think it's a really good representation of what as a suicider can might think. And then the other two are the hours. The hours. It's based on a book. Um, I think the author is of the book is Michael uh, Cunningham. I'm not sure. I saw the movie. I want to read the book. And it's about three women, how they are related one to the other between them, and one of these three stories is about Virginia Woolf, um, and it's about um, being a woman, about maternity, about solitude, and it's starring Mary Streep, um, which is Nicole Kidman and Julia Moore. And the last one I saw some weeks ago in the European Film Festival, European Seville Film Festival, or well, I don't know. Uh, um, and it's about the name is After Some. Um, it's about a father and a daughter, and how the daughter remembers um, one some holidays with his father, and and how and you can see how this father um, doesn't want to show um, his his feelings to his daughter, how he really feel, um, and it's really sad. It's really sad. I was like half of the movie trying not to cry, uh, but it was impossible. So yeah, that's it. That's what I wanted to say about suicide, about Emile Durkheim. I hope you like it. You like it. And yeah, and that's it. Bye.